Again, ancient Europe, definitely an idea of there's us, and then there are barbarians who are different from us, and they come in and attack us or sack Rome, and so on. If we look at the medieval up through the early modern period, there grows to be this idea that the civilized people, the organized people, the cultural people are those in the north of Europe, and the farther south you get, including into southern Italy and so on, after Rome was sacked in the 5th century, that basically everything down there is kind of less cultured. In the 18th century, just give you a tiny bit of history here, not too much history. Some people might think, oh my God, he's talking about the 18th century. We might not get to the 21st century for a long time. Just a quick, this is just little bites, all right? In the 18th century, Enlightenment figures, remember Enlightenment's all about reason, begin to kind of reorient things in a different way. That reason and enlightenment and culture and civilization is something shared by Western Europe. It's a concept that really emerges only in the 18th century. Western Europe would not have made sense to people in the 17th century or earlier. So they begin to talk about, what Italy and France and Germany and England and Scandinavia have in common, and contrast it to things farther east. One of the things that comes in with this is Enlightenment thinkers traveling to the east, to Poland, to Hungary, and to Russia, and drawing this contrast. These people are so fundamentally different from us. They can acquire, some of them can acquire characteristics like us, especially if, like Catherine the Great, for example, they happen to be actually German by ethnicity, and they can be totally part of our world, but there is a gradient. They begin to see a kind of a gradient that things get less civilized the farther one goes east. And this becomes, by the early 19th century, something that's kind of taken for granted, that there is this fundamental difference east and west. Now the modern era, beginning in the 19th century, adds another level to it, and that is the level of nationalism, where more and more countries begin to define themselves nationally as, France is not just a place that is controlled by the French king, but as a group of people who are united by something. I'll say something in a moment about the different ways that can be united. But the key issue here is that with nationalism comes the idea of immutability, that people who belong to a nation might have innate characteristics. We use this all the time when we say, maybe just sort of as a joke, in a meme or something like that, that Germans are really orderly, Italians are romantic, Russians are really passionate, or whatever it might be. Those are assumptions we make about nations. They have innate, immutable characteristics. And this too would not have made sense before the modern era, simply because people did not classify themselves in this way. They might recognize the categories, if there's such a thing as being French or Russian or Ukrainian or what have you, but not ascribing to it characteristics. Because before the modern era, it wouldn't have made sense to say that a Russian peasant and a Russian king had something in common. Maybe they could communicate with one another if that ever happened, but they wouldn't have innate characteristics that you said, yeah, they're both Russian. That would have been bizarre to say, like talking about people from another planet almost. But the national era brings that idea, and here's what's so important about that, again, is that it is kind of fundamental to our way of thinking. And unless we stop ourselves and say, wait a second, that's not fair to say that Germans are orderly or whatever kind of group are always late to meetings or don't have a sense of time. That just, it can feel to our 21st century sensibilities as being kind of discriminatory and even racist. But we still comfortably kind of use it without always recognizing it. And it is born in the 19th century. Here's why that's important, because it then raises this fundamental question, okay, if there are these immutable characteristics, and then you layer it on top of this Enlightenment idea that to the West are people who are organized, civilized, cultured, and so on. To the East, they're not. Those two together sort of suggest you can never join. You can never be one of us because you have this fundamental characteristic. You're just different. One of the ways we can think about this, I think that I would talk about this a moment ago, is that if we think about nationalism, there are fundamentally two kinds of nationalism. There's exclusive nationalism, which says, if you weren't born one of us, you will never be one of us, because it's blood. If you don't have X blood in your veins, you can never be one of us. Inclusive nationalism says, sure, because we're about values, not blood. And American nationalism usually, I recognize that in this era right now it's a little more complicated, but American nationalism usually is of the inclusive variety. We recognize that if somebody says to me, and they have an accent and says, I'm American, I might sort of think, yeah, where were you born? But I would not say, no, you are not an American. Right? But that is a much more natural thing to say in other parts of the world where there are ideas of exclusive nationalism. That you can say as much as you want that you're Polish or Italian or so on, but you're not. So the inclusive nationalism, sure, it's fundamental to Americans. But not only. It's potentially true for other groups. I'll just mention one because it's kind of relevant here, although it kind of screws up the argument I want to make. Another example of inclusive nationalism is Soviet nationalism. Sure, in the Soviet Union, that's based around values, not around blood. And so if you say, you don't even have to go to the Soviet Union in the era when it was around. You could be living your whole life in America and say, I am a Soviet because I so powerfully believe in those values. My homeland, and there are plenty of communists who would say this, my homeland is the Soviet Union. And the Soviet response would be, absolutely. Now, it could get weird. You could say, well, it's my homeland, and go there. And then they could say, yeah, we don't trust you because you're a traitor and so on, and you might go to a camp. But there was still that idea of inclusive nationalism. The European Union also is based upon an inclusive nationalism. That Europe is based upon a set of values, and I'll have more to say about those values in a moment. But there too, ideally, yes, you can become a European. You can say, this is a place I identify with, whether I'm a citizen of whichever country, however important that is, but you can identify with that place. And in a way, we can see, actually constantly over the last century at least, we can see this kind of struggle between these two versions of nationalism. And so, I guess to sort of wrap up that little aspect here, it's kind of natural, especially at moments of crisis, like after the January 6th insurrection, to identify nationalism as being a bad thing. And that's by no means the point. Nationalism can be a good thing, and we really want to ask, wait, what kind of nationalism? Inclusive or exclusive? And it's not necessarily an either or. I think all societies, I think some are purely exclusive. But even American, as we know, is not purely inclusive nationalism. There's still plenty of a sense of a border, and many immigrants to this country have found, or even long-time residents of this country, born in this country, have found, yeah, there's always there's that potential limit. The Cold War plays to these stereotypes and these ingrained ideas and builds them up. Because in the Cold War, as we tried to make sense of the way that some people were behind the Iron Curtain and some were not, and the division of Europe, one of the things that grew out of that experience was a lot of thinking about what was it that, what accounts for that division, and is that division permanent? And so one way to argue about it is or to articulate this would be to say, well, you know, those people are comfortable with an authoritarian regime. That's just how they are. In the extreme version, and I feel silly almost even referencing this, so don't take this as kind of a standard idea. I think most people have long since made fun of it. But one extreme version is, well, the Russians, when their children are very small, they bind them very tightly in swaddling clothes, and so you get used to being, yes, I will do what I'm told because I can't move, and so then people grow up just liking security more. And even if most people would, we can all laugh at that, there still was this powerful sense that there was something sort of natural about the authoritarian regimes in the communist regimes east of the Iron Curtain. And, in some ways that's not wrong, because systems do shape behavior, absolutely. And if people grow up under an authoritarian system, they, of course, become used to it. And this is another really key point that I want to make before we switch to the post-communist era, which is where I want to spend most of my time. That when we think about the relationship of people with different political systems, a key part here is imagination. There is a limited number of systems that we can imagine in ordinary times. In other words, right now, to give an example, if right now I were to try to pitch to you the value of having a hereditary monarchy in the United States, it wouldn't make a lot of sense. It would be extremely difficult to imagine. You'd be unlikely to say, well, you're right. That's a really good point. We should have a king or queen. Because it is far outside of our world. It's not something we tend to imagine. Or if I were to say, the United States should be an anarchist collective. You might say, wow, I think anarchist collectives are super cool. I live in one myself, or something like that. But the entire 300 million people, right, really hard to wrap our heads around. Because we don't imagine that, day to day. We live in a world that is relatively bounded, and even something that's only 5% towards, as radical as anything I just mentioned, like we should have a three-party system, is difficult to imagine, let alone we should be an anarchist collective. So we are kind of bounded by experiences, and so too, people who grow up several generations even in an authoritarian system are going to be bounded by that. And this very idea is actually kind of fundamental to how Americans actually view the world. This is now ancient history. Before some of you were born, but when we invaded Iraq, Donald Rumsfeld said we will be welcomed as liberators. And the thing was, okay, that was not true, but it was a logical American thing to say, because it presumes that people of Iraq, for example, are at heart democracy-loving. And given the moment, they would just say, here it is, democracy, we're going to totally do it, thank you. Whereas instead, and this is no shade on the Iraqis, like, wait, what exactly is this all about? What's the product we're being sold here? I don't know how to experience this. This is not part of my world, and so on. In the same way that we might all, in some weird alternate universe, all agree anarchist collective would totally work here. But most people would say, I don't quite get it, because it's outside of our imaginary world. But Americans, because of our world, we do tend to see that, sort of imagine that kind of, or at least in the past, maybe the Iraqi war kind of brought into this idea, but we kind of have this imagination that in everybody is slumbering the natural desire towards democracy. And all you need to do is rip the cover off and people go, yay, we're free. And that doesn't happen. But that doesn't mean that they would never want it, right? So we're sort of in between two things. One, an argument that everybody is a Democrat waiting to be born, and then the other side that some people can do that and some people, they're just stunted somehow, and they'll just never figure it out. And my point here is that neither of those are true. Right? So now we start to turn towards the former Soviet Union. It is not true that everybody in the Soviet Union was, and loads of works by political scientists and historians from the late communist and early post-communist period that conveyed this assumption. It was not true that they were all just seething, just waiting. Oh, I hate this stuff. I can't wait until we are free because this is not who I am. Totally not true. But it's also not true that they're like, yeah, this is perfect. Wouldn't change a thing. And they would remain in that idea. So rather than thinking in terms of either innate character or any kind of innate character, so either everyone is innately Democrat, freedom-loving, whatever, or people are innately different kinds of things depending upon their blood, much, much more interesting to think, okay, characteristics can change. So how do they change? What makes it possible for people to be different? So before I go on and sort of leave that whole sort of history up through 1990 or so behind, any questions or comments? And those of you who can speak up because you're not on Facebook? Yeah.
So what's a modern example of a exclusive nationalist state?
A good example of an exclusive nationalist state, I could go to more extreme ones, but just to be a little provocative, I'll say France, and which is kind of weird, because France is based upon values: liberty, fraternity, equality. Remember? Oh my God, right. And so France, in a way, is like the United States fundamentally. But there's a really interesting article, I think in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago, about the emigration from France of Muslims who say, I am so French. I love France. All of those values, that's totally me. I'm French. And I'm being told by people in shops, neighbors, whatever, you're not French. And so finally I'm like, wow, I don't feel I belong here. And then they're living in London or New York, whatever, and say, I am still super French. And the great thing is that here in London or in New York, people say, you're French. Whereas back in Paris, they're like, you're not. And so France is actually it's the most interesting kind of example because it's got this incredible tension there between something that is so obvious, that is enshrined in their constitution, that, yep, these are the things, this is what makes you French. It doesn't say in the French Constitution you have to have French blood, but these ideas are there. And yet, there's a more popular version that is exclusive. Now, there are systems that are exclusive by design, where the explicit reference is that the values and the heredity are sort of enshrined in the system. I mean, the most extreme examples of that would be something like Nazi Germany. That's sort of like the farthest example. I guess I'm not going to try to give any current examples because I'm going to start thinking about, do they really say that and so on. But I guess I would say that many societies act exclusive, even if they're nominally inclusive. Maybe one thing I would say is that there are some places like France where it's relatively easy to gain citizenship. And there are others where it's almost impossible, like Switzerland, for example. And that's kind of a tricky example, but to some extent we can measure it by how easy it is to get citizenship. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
So I had a question. So with Belarus's recent involvement, even though it's called a democracy, but it doesn't necessarily fully have a democratic process. How does that play into what was the democratic peace theory? And how
okay. Right. So yeah, there's one sort of kind of thing we have to kind of have on the side of our brains here, and that is that it used to be super clear what we meant by democracy and not. And so if I'm talking about Ukraine as European democracy, you're right to say, yeah, what about these formal democracies like Belarus and so on? The thing is that so I'll just bracket this just sort of as a kind of a complication to the whole story, is that we do now have these formal democracies that are not democratic. They have learned to the value of aping systems in terms of having a parliament, having elections, maybe some level of freedom of association, freedom of the press, things like that. And there's a gradation of these. And so it becomes much harder to say that country is authoritarian because they might look formally like something else. So, from an analytical perspective, it's easy to say Belarus is an authoritarian, undemocratic country, and so is Russia, and so is even today Hungary. But it can be much harder to define that if we then start sort of looking at those formal prospects. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Here, comments, questions? Okay, so now we've got Ukraine. And I'm going to sort of start this part by framing it this way. I was thinking about this the other day, and I sort of blurted it out during the forum that REI posted last week. And then I've been thinking about it ever since. That, there are a lot of countries that have changed incredibly over the last 30 years in Europe. I was living in Poland during the fall of communism and spent time in Hungary and Czech Republic and Slovakia, Slovenia, Lithuania a little bit, Ukraine, a little bit of Bulgaria, and in Bosnia, now that I recall that. So I saw a lot of the ways in which things changed. But I think one could make the case, and I'm still thinking this through, that no country has changed more than Ukraine in the last 30 years. No country has made a greater change. If you were to, and I don't know for sure that this would be backed up by, if you could look at Eurobarometer surveys and so on, and maybe that would be a way to test this hypothesis that I'm throwing out here. That if we were to look at attitudes and self-imaginings, that we would find no place that has changed more from about 1989 to today than Ukraine. And then the question is why. And so we have a neat story to tell here, because there are three. I guess now we're in the fourth phase of this, the fourth stage, if you will. The first stage is the fall of communism, 1989 to 1991. I use those years. 1989 is when communism fell in Central Europe, if you will. 1991 is when the Soviet Union fell apart. So that period during which things fall apart. Now, I've just used that verb, fall apart, but it's not really accurate, at least not as far as Ukraine is concerned. Ukraine was undoubtedly crucial to the breakup of the Soviet Union, because it was the largest component of the Soviet Union, other than Russia, of course, but also because it was the most organized, with the partial exception of the Baltic states, Baltic republics at that time. But since Ukraine is vastly larger, 50 million people compared to 1.5 million per Baltic republic, give or take, its impact was so much greater, the impact of its civic mobilization. So the interesting thing about the fall of the Soviet Union, from a Ukrainian perspective, or is Ukraine should be at the center of the story of the breakup of the Soviet Union. And generally it is at the center of the story when it's told right. And for a couple of reasons. One, by chance, that the Chernobyl reactor is still located in Ukraine. And the explosion on April 26, 1986, was a very important move that started the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev towards greater and greater liberalization, but also that energized the mobilization of the Ukrainians. And, by the way, of other groups as well, in the Baltics and in Poland, as they were also affected by it. Because there was something that affected people in a very visceral way. And that's, that's sort of a digression about how, well, maybe it's not a digression, about how civic activism starts. I think this is actually kind of important that, a thought experiment that I often try with my students is imagine going down onto Kirkwood or walking through campus with a sign that says, democracy. Most people will just look at that like, yeah, you're not going to get many followers because it's kind of vague. And people might generally agree we should have more democracy, but it's kind of like there's sort of a, why am I going to put, my efforts into following this extremely vague sign? I think of this sometimes when I'm biking around town and I see signs that say, reform redistricting now. I'm not even quite sure what that means, and I'm certainly not going to, join your movement because it's vague and it's not super exciting. But something like, there is poisonous stuff falling from the sky and we weren't told about it, that will get you mobilized, right? You really do need to have concrete things. People can say, holy crap, I am afraid and I feel that I can do something about it, or that I have to, right? That I have to be engaged because this is really immediate. And so that's one of the things that really jumpstarts. There is a longer history of Ukrainian descent, but I think I promised no more long history. So that's something that really jumpstarts the Ukrainians. So during the years, really from 87, 86 even, on to 91, we see a lot of civic mobilization in Ukraine, and especially in the western part of Ukraine, where Chernobyl is located. There are other reasons why there's greater activism there, and I'm happy to talk about that, but that might be somewhat of a digression here. But during those years, we see a lot of environmental mobilization, not surprising, not only about Chernobyl, but that sort of gets things going. We see nationalist organization because more people in Western Ukraine at that time spoke Ukrainian than people farther to the east, so they're more likely to experience it. They also have so I am getting into this. They also have a different religious tradition within the Orthodox Church, or adjacent to the Orthodox Church. They're farther east, so they're more likely to perceive that as being an important thing. But there's also a fair amount of civic mobilization as well. For example, around peace issues, or around local control. So these kind of things emerge over those 5 years or so, and they do play a really important role in the way that that even Ukrainian leaders begin to, in the period, say 1990, 91, begin to kind of position themselves away from Soviet control, and then are the first to declare independence after Ukraine is the first to declare independence after the failed coup in August of 1991 when hardline communists tried to save the Soviet Union. They failed, and then almost immediately Ukraine declares its independence, leading to the total breakup in December of 1991. But this was just the first phase. And what I would point out is that, first of all, it was somewhat regionally limited, and Ukraine is a very large and diverse place. Different combinations of language and religion, but also fundamentally different sort of economic traditions, I guess would be a way of putting it. So there really wasn't that kind of unification and sort of, I guess I'll just say uneven civic mobilization. Secondly, this was still something quite new for most Ukrainians. This was a moment, absolutely, when there was a perception in the West as well, and I've already kind of referred to this, that, at least among some, that all you had to do was expose people to the world of the market and the opportunities that are provided by that, and transformation will be kind of almost like a chemical reaction. Boom! Everyone will be just like, yeah, why was I deprived this? This is what I want. It is something more complicated. Again, it's not something innate that everybody just naturally wants this. People just want to be free in that kind of a way. So that period exposed certain interest, civic mobilization, but it also showed that Ukrainians weren't necessarily really, really ready. And one of the ways we could see this is that there was a kind of a continuity of elites. It was really possible for someone who had been a leader in the communist period to now say, I'm actually a nationalist. I love Ukraine, and be elected, and be quite successful. Simply because you don't have the elites who are, and maybe put that in quotes. I don't mean people who are already in power, but people who have the potential, let's say, to step in and say, here I am, I'm ready, and I've got the concept, and I want to be engaged. So that phase one, it was very exciting. It was a really dramatic time, and it was a dramatic change towards independence, or to independence, and a gradual transformation of the economy, and a turn toward more Ukrainian culture. But it was really only a first phase if we're thinking about how change would happen. So on one hand, sure, civil society, nationalism, but it's really at a kind of an experimental stage. Jump ahead 15 years. The Orange Revolution of 2004. I'm wearing orange socks to so I'm wearing the Ukrainian colors. I just wanted to note that, but I also feel bound to the theme of the Orange Revolution, so I'm covering all my bases here, Ukrainian-wise. Orange Revolution is now also kind of ancient history, so just a brief thing what's going on there. The president of the country, who was a former communist leader, there was a presidential election. There was an opponent, Viktor Yushchenko, who also had his roots in the communist elite, but had really moved himself quite far towards a more Ukrainian and Western-oriented position. People tied to the president poisoned Viktor Yushchenko. So this is the one image you might all remember from the Orange Revolution, that the poison caused his face to be horribly disfigured by dioxin. These horrible sort of, his face looked like he'd been attacked by aliens or something like that. And he almost died of it. And in this, the presidential election was falsified, so that the government-backed candidate won by a little bit, and Yushchenko was defeated. Whereupon people came to the central square in Kiev, the Maidan, began to protest, and then, this is kind of crucial, it's actually a really crucial point, something I want to say in a moment, they occupied the square. And they occupied the square for almost 2 months. They set up tents. Yushchenko and some of his colleagues among the politicians, in particular a figure named Yulia Timoshenko, is also kind of famous because she kind of embodied literally sort of the Ukrainian ideal by this great long golden braid that she would sort of prominently wear on her head. So, she looks so uber Ukrainian. It can't be more Ukrainian looking. And they kind of give these presentations, and there would also be rock bands on the square and so on, and people were camped there for weeks on end in the winter. This was rather powerful. It did lead to ultimately they were successful. It led to a rerunning of the election, which Yushchenko won. And so this was a period when it seemed as if, and it is weirdly connected to the Iraq moment, because it comes during the Iraq War. It really is connected to a moment when it seemed as if everybody's going to turn towards democracy. It was part of what became known as the color revolutions. There were revolutionary moments also in several other, well, a little bit in Belarus, in Armenia, in Azerbaijan, in Kyrgyzia, and outside of the former Soviet Union, in Lebanon, for example, the sense that people everywhere are rising up and bringing about change. But if we can look back, I mean, I was caught up by that euphoria too. It was incredibly exciting. We can see sort of positive and negatives. On the well, let me leave the positive for a moment to start with the negative. Because one of the things that in retrospect was going on was it really was oriented around leaders, around political leaders who were not themselves sort of grassroots figures. So that allowed people, sure, to be engaged and be on the square and so on, and that's really exciting, and doing their own self-organizing. But there's another level at which, okay, we got Viktor Yushchenko elected, now we're good. And our good leaders will take care of us. And that's never a good thing in terms of democracy. When all your hopes are in a leader, sure, it works out if the person is really, really awesome. But that's sort of expecting everybody to be, I don't know, Nelson Mandela or something like that. And Yushchenko, not to get into it, wasn't Nelson Mandela. Also somewhat of a corrupt figure, also not maybe a great leader, etc. But more important was that people were able to say, okay, we did it, we're done, we no longer have to be mobilized. So that is definitely a negative. But, and I'll sort of punt this to phase 3, it is nonetheless crucially important that for 2 months people were organizing. So, let me explain why that's important when we jump to phase 3. I mean, this is one of the reasons I think that Ukraine has changed so much, or it's one of the signs of it, that one can't think of another place that has had 3 successful revolutionary moments, or okay, successful raises a question, so maybe I'll withdraw that, but 3, that's another word I want to use, other than successful. Well, 3 revolutionary moments that have productive. Okay, there we are. I've managed to avoid it a little bit. Productive revolutionary moments in 30 years. The 1989-91, the Orange Revolution, and then what's often known as the Euromaidan Revolution of 2013-2014. That one was really interesting. The man whom Yushchenko had finally defeated in the election was, in the interim between 2004 and 2013, was elected president anyway. Again, people had sort of taken their eye off the ball, if you will. Whatever, it's fine, and so on. And so he gets elected. And the crucial moment here, and this is what makes the Euromaidan such a fascinating moment, the crucial moment was not a falsified election, which often provokes revolution, but rather that there was an accord brewing with the European Union. And the president pulled off and said, no, I want to sign an agreement with the EU. Moscow's looking really good. Moscow promised something better. Thank you, EU. I'm talking with Moscow. Which enraged a lot of people in Ukraine, not only in Kiev, but in many cities. And it was time to go back and occupy the square again. Now, this does not end as well. First of all, there are 3 ways in which it was different. One way that was good is that there was no central leader, because it wasn't about an election. So that's actually a really good thing. There was also more organization, much more civic organization, some of it bad, if you will. I shouldn't even put that in quotes. I mean, there were sort of right-wing nationalists that appeared, and some who were fascist allied, and that allowed some people to paint the whole thing. But really, most of the organization was much more powerfully civic organization of all kinds. But there was another part to it, which was much more state repression. Hardly anybody was a casualty of the Orange Revolution of 2004. There were hundreds of people killed by government snipers and other means during the Euromaidan Revolution. And during it, after the president had fled the country, Putin took the opportunity to invade Ukraine, by annexing or claiming to annex the Crimean Peninsula and invading the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, claiming he wasn't, and sort of allowing for these breakaway regions to appear. So, in a way, then, and this is just bracketing this point here, if we think about the history of the last 50 years, I would argue that there is a really interesting period of history from 1974, when Portugal, Spain, and Greece have democratic revolutions in 74, 75, to the Maidan 40 years later, which is kind of when the ideal of nonviolent democratic revolutions appears, at least for the moment, to be buried. Doesn't mean democratic revolution can't happen, but from 74 through 2014, we've got all these things I've talked about, and the Arab Spring too, and South Africa and the Philippines and a whole bunch of others. It's quite an amazing 4 decades. But the invasion of Ukraine, as well as the repression, seems to kind of foretell what has happened since then in places like Hong Kong, Iran, and Myanmar. So that's just a brief commercial for sort of the downsides of what has happened since then. But I'm an optimistic person, so let me sort of kind of return to what is so valuable about those square occupations of 2004 and 2013-14. Most of us have probably not participated in something like that. Some of you, especially some of you watching, may have participated in Occupy protests, and some of those occupied for a long time, and they're not dissimilar. Here's something interesting, by the way. In the years between the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan, I began studying this a little bit, and one of the things I thought about was, okay, how common are these occupations? Turns out, not very common. I've only been able to, if we say, okay, we're looking at people occupying a public place in large numbers for a month. Tiananmen Square, 1989. The Orange Revolution, the Euromaidan. Definitely Tahrir Square in Cairo in 2011. There are a few others, but not many. There's kind of an example in Chile, there's sort of an example in Romania. We could talk about whether the Occupy movement ever rises to that level. There just aren't many of these. It feels like a common thing because it's been happening a lot in the last 20, 30 years. And why that's true is also interesting. But I look farther back in time, like, I'm a historian, I gotta find these. Paris Commune of 1871, maybe, kind of. There are, of course, occupations of factories, and that's also super interesting. The factories are occupied by workers. And so that expands, and for that matter, occupation of buildings by students. So we can kind of expand it a little bit farther. Overall, it's not a super common thing to happen. That's why, again, most of us don't ever experience it. But now let's just sort of imagine what exactly happens there. When you occupy a space, if you just imagine that we've all said, we're going to go occupy the courthouse square in Bloomington. Off we go. Let's presume we have a cause, right? We're going to do this. We've got a really powerful cause, and we're all going, and we're going to all text our friends who are going to come, and they're also going to bring us tents and food and so on. Super fun. But very quickly, there raise these questions of, first of all, the practical ones. Okay, who's going to clean up the trash? Who is going to be sleeping when who is going to be making sure the police aren't coming? Who's going to be organizing the food? Who's going to be keeping lists of medicine that is needed? Who's going to be distributing blankets and sleeping bags that are donated? Who's going to be doing all of these other things? Somebody's got to do it. Meanwhile, though, we don't want leaders, right? Because we're trying to be egalitarian. So we've got to do this while trying to be horizontal. Which also means there's going to be arguments about politics. There's always going to be somebody who says, I alone can handle this, right? Leave all the sleeping bags to me. And everyone else is like, I totally don't trust you, I don't know who you are, and so on. Or situations where, wait a second, are the women doing all of the dishwashing? Could we talk about that? Right? So and those are conversations that happen in these situations. But my point is they're incredibly productive conversations. We haven't even gotten to the point of, okay, we need to drop our list of demands, to put on our little cardboard sign, or to be broadcasting to people who come and join us for a little while so they have something to clap to. We need to talk about those as well. And there too, we're going to run into the possibility that somebody says, hey, I'm a leader, I'm charismatic, and others are like, no, that's not why we're here. So we're going to have these incredible conversations. And it might fall apart. And some of us, we're all just going to say, okay, screw this, I'm going home. This is a circus, or it's sick, or whatever. But maybe we work through those conversations. And in the process, even those of us, like all of us, we've grown up with democracy, we totally get how it works, it's totally amazing, and we vote, and we put out our recycling, and all those really amazing things that we do, we still would have to work through all of this stuff and figure out at that moment. We're learning toleration. I don't really like your values, but you're really great at organizing the dishwashing schedule, so that's cool. We're learning how things are apportioned, so that some people are writing signs and some people are cleaning up trash, and sometimes they get to switch. And maybe most important, we're learning how to hierarchize our values. Because there's a whole bunch of things we're all interested in, but we've got to figure out which ones are most important and kind of agree on that and be able to project that out there. So these moments of occupation, or these months, if you like, of occupation, are incredibly fertile producers of civic tradition, civic habits, and, dare I say, democracy. Okay, so that's a pretty big argument, especially since I'm sort of issuing a call and we also go occupy something. So let me just stop here for a moment and ask questions or comments about this. And then I'll say, sort of bring this together about the current moment, phase 4. But before I do so, comments, questions, ideas? You're buying it. Totally. I mean, right, democracy now. Okay, so what kind of an argument have I made then? I am making an argument for the transformation of a community, even a community as large as a national one, like that of Ukraine. That through practice, right? So it's not simply you expose people to the market or to democracy, and they all just suddenly rip off their Soviet masks and become Western or something like that. On the other hand, it's not the case that you can lead them to democracy and capitalism and whatever else, and they'll just shrug because they're not those kind of people. But rather that practice experience can transform a people. And if that is true, then we can expect that to happen in a place that has had over 3 decades, over a generation and a half, if you will, 3 revolutionary moments, which have been mass mobilization moments. Mass mobilization is kind of a tricky idea, but I guess I'll just say there have been moments of significant social mobilization where thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people at one level or another have been confronted with that opportunity to rethink or to think about their values in a way that we generally don't have to. And to think about what it means to be organized, what it means to be involved, what it means to participating. Again, things that we tend not to have to think about in our very ordinary lives. So now we can see what happens when a country like that is invaded. That, it should be clear from all that I've said here that if there's one thing that I believe does not apply, actually in any of these cases, any of these 4 cases, it's spontaneity. I do not believe in spontaneity. Okay, I believe in spontaneity, let's have a good time, but I do not believe in spontaneity as a force in history. In each of these cases, people are engaged because there are practices and because there is social organization, both in a formal sense, people who have organizations that you can belong to, donate to, show up to, know whom to contact. You show up at a thing and you say, oh yeah, I totally know him. He da-da-da-da, whatever. Yeah, she has that organization or she blogs or whatever it is, and therefore I recognize that authority or that social capital, if we don't want to go with authority. There's a place I can get ideas, I can go along, which is incredibly important. And sure, it turns out also that that is a way where a civil militia and maybe eventually a partisan underground army emerges. I mostly here have been privileging the nonviolent, but right now we can also recognize that that's also how people can say, yes, I know, because this is actually kind of higher stakes, right? The idea is like, to decide I would like to have a weapon in order to join the resistance. I know where to do that. I trust the person who's giving me a weapon and who's training me and who's telling me how to make a Molotov cocktail or whatever that might be. That also requires an enormous amount of social trust and social organization, which, as it happens, is the case today in Ukraine. Something that one could not have imagined would have been possible, honestly. Well, one constantly wanted to imagine it to be possible, but in hindsight you can say, yeah, that was not Ukraine in 1989-91. That was really not Ukraine in 2004. Maybe not even, it wasn't quite Ukraine in 2013-14. I think it could have been, if not for Putin, but it is Ukraine today. Okay, I think I've said everything I need to say. Everything I want to say. Are there any questions or anything? If not, wait, I should give you a second. All right, thank you all very much. I've really enjoyed being with you.
Thank you for coming.